So the way I would describe it is that the emergence of a lot of these schools of thought, I think not coincidentally, emerged with the telegraph, like in that kind of era, right? So the well-known credit theorists or the chartalists that began emerging around the time when money became so removed from the metals that people started to think, why do we need the metals? And then that led to a lot of development of some of these other types of models that are different from the models that were there before them. And so I do think it's valuable to have engineers look at the monetary system. I don't, I think the fact that you have an engineering background, and I think that your view of the telegraph affecting silver was spot on. And I referenced that in the book and kind of contrast it with Barry Eichengreen's view of why kind of the gold standard won out. And I sided more firmly in your camp on that whole thing. And I think the same thing is generally it's a technological impact that affects not just what we use as money, but even how we think about money. Because how you think about money then gives all it's basically it kind of builds momentum from there. And so I think that when you see people say that money is just what the government issues, is essentially it's recency bias. They're just basically saying in the modern era, that's what money is. And then before then, it was really that what sparked these things, I would argue, was kind of the shifting nature of technology, the need for centralization, at least in that era. And then that gave them all sorts of ammo, basically, to start going out and doing this. In the current era, that's where Bitcoin's interesting because that starts kind of putting winds in the sails of people that had the other view, right? It's like the technology can impact who's winning the argument a lot more than just winning the argument can. And so one thing I cover in the book, for example, is that with all the perils of fractional reserve banking, it's spread everywhere. And there's no country on a gold standard. And it's like, why do things win so thoroughly everywhere? And a lot of it just has to do with technology. And it's like if you're going to win and take that back, it's got to be partially through technology. I mean, part of it's also spreading ideas and kind of, pointing out the perils of what's happening to help people adopt that technology. But it still ultimately comes down to you need the robust technology to make that possible.
Yeah, I think I agree. And in the fiat standard, I get into I try and steelman the case for fiat, why fiat makes sense. And it comes down to more than just the fact that people put guns to other people's heads to accept it. And I think, it goes back to the idea that it is the speed of moving credit. So whereas in the Bitcoin standard, I focus on salability across time, at which gold excels because it's difficult to make more gold. With fiat, I think you have to admit that it has better salability across space because a central bank that is part of an oligarchy and a monopoly with the government, protected by the government, nobody's going to come and shoot the bank owner. That central bank is able to move money across borders faster than you can move a bar of gold. And so a bar of gold is better for moving value across time. If you wanted to save money for 20 years, a bar of gold is going to do better than any form of fiat money that has ever existed. But if you wanted to do it for moving it across 2,100 kilometers, 2,000 kilometers, the central bank is going to cost a lot less. So there's no way around that. Moving physical money around is pretty expensive. And I think that's why as trade became more and more important, credit became more and more important, the central banks had an enormous amount of leeway where they could essentially create new money out of thin air because having your money at a central bank and having it at a bank that is engaging in fractional reserve banking still meant less loss of value than moving a physical bar of gold around. And that's why people mostly suck it up and still continue to deal with their central bank because they don't really have an alternative, or at least they didn't until very recently when a certain digital technology came about that changes things.
I try to also, like you steelman fiat, I try to steelman basically the credit theory in my book and basically kind of show that it came about with this faster era of money. And so as I kind of compared commodity theory of money, credit theory of money, kind of trying to walk through why people came to believe what they believe. That was like a big kind of chunk of the book. And that the whole kind of just process of falling back on whatever's the most efficient ledger. And in the modern era, these central banking ledgers have acquired so much network power, so much government power that they become the fallback, the most liquidity, the easiest way to send money. And that's the era that we live in. And I think it's one of those things where it's hard to get around that until Bitcoin.
Yeah. Your central thesis probably in the book is that money is a ledger. Why do you say that? Why do you think money is a ledger?
So as best I can tell, the person who originated this was probably Vences Casares from Argentina. There's not a lot of writing on the subject. He just basically talked about it 8-9 years ago on a number of talks. It kind of trickled down, and I've heard it from other people. Like I cited John Pfeffer, who ascribes to that view. And basically, it's the reconciliation between the credit theory and the commodity theory. Because going back to your prior point, we were looking for kind of like strong arguments from that other side. I think that one of the strongest arguments from them, from the credit camp, if you try to steelman it, is that they point out that even in very early societies, credit naturally forms. It's a way, if you're trying to solve the double quintessence of wants, there's really kind of two ways to do it. Either you have the most saleable good that just it simplifies all the transactions because it's on one side of every transaction, or you defer through time so that you don't have to have your two wants coinciding at the same time. You can solve when you have a surplus in everything, you don't need anything from someone else. You can either use gift culture or credit to extend them what they need or want in exchange for knowing that there will be time in the future where you'll want something, and then you could call on that favor, call on that saving, call on that credit. And so basically there's kind of that anthropological research. And so what I do try to do is I try to talk to people that have that view and show some of the limitations of that view and reconcile it, because even in eras where credit was important, you still need a saleable unit of account, right? If you're just doing credit and there's no foundational unit of account, then you're ultimately just doing barter, just more efficiently. The reason I do a ledger is because throughout the book, I keep falling back to the same question of who controls the ledger. In a commodity money, we're basically relying on a ledger. It's just that nature's controlling the ledger. Nature sets the bounds that are outside of our power to affect. How quickly you can get gold out of the ground, how quickly gold can move around, and we're updating this kind of shared ledger amongst ourselves when we transact in it. And various credit-based ledgers are even more literal ledgers, but of course they're dilutive, they're censorable, they have a lot more, kind of mostly cons, but some pros, like this, mainly the speed issue. And so what I kind of do is just show that over the course of history, what we use as money changes over time. And it comes down to what ledger are we trusting, both for our savings and our payments, sometimes the same ledger, sometimes different ledgers. And one of the fascinating things is I really dove into Jevons' 1875 book, Money and the Mechanism of Exchange. And he talked, it's the reason it's interesting is because it's within that decade after the telegraph era started, really. It was sort of the beginning of the international gold standard. And he's just it was kind of like the same book written in that era. Like he started out talking about the history of money, kind of the nuances of money, how things developed, and then he's analyzing the current situation and the near future. And he's talking about how increasingly centralized it's getting. And the fascinating thing was he's talking about how it's become so efficient that you barely ever have to move gold. Most people don't want to have gold. They just want to rely on their bank because it's so much more efficient. And he's talking about how good this was for things. But at the same time, he's like, this is now levered 20 to 1. And we have to remember that every single one of these claims, like if 5% of people come in on regular banking hours and request their gold, this thing blows up. And of course, in World War I, it did. And so it's kind of fascinating to see, like, not just going back and thinking about that time, but actually going back and reading what intelligent people were saying at the time when they analyzed the system in the present. And he did it objectively. He was saying, okay, here's all the pros. Here's what's remarkable about the system. He's like, it would be irrational if, the UK and America are trading goods and services. If they had two streams of like gold bars going back and forth, that'd be wildly inefficient. So it's like naturally we're going to net this. Naturally we're going to have basically paper and telegraph claims going back and forth with only occasional rare gold settlements, for resolving major imbalances. But then the problem is this becomes so efficient, it's almost frightening. And then it becomes so disconnected from the underlying and that it becomes fragile. And so part of the thesis was that when the transaction part got so much more efficient than the settlement part, it was almost inevitable that we were going to end up in this type of world, at least temporarily, because there was no better mechanism. Basically, nothing short of like a hyper disciplined government would be able to do that. Like basically all the ways to fail, like there's basically 99 ways to fail for every one way to succeed. And so as that technology developed, it was naturally going to be centralizing, it was naturally going to be corrupted, and it was naturally going to lead to kind of the world we have now.
I'm going to quibble here with the word naturally, because I think had it not been for coercive government intervention and coercive government monopolies propping up this mechanism, I don't think it would have gotten us to where we are right now. I think in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, we'd have had a bunch of business cycles. They'd have been blown up. And then if governments did not interfere, if governments did not bail out the supposed geniuses of finance who had always, the story is always the same. I was just thinking of this the other day. There's no such thing as a genius in finance. Finance is a boring thing, and if somebody's being a genius in it, they're not being a genius, they're just using leverage. They're taking risk. That's it. That's the only way that you can be a genius with finance. Without leverage, finance is just plumbing. There are no plumbers out there that are celebrated for being able to lay plumbing for a house at 1% of the cost of their competitors. You got to bring the pipes and you have to lay them, and maybe you make a 1% improvement over your competitor, 5%, 10% improvement. But if you're in finance and you're making 100 times the returns of everybody else, you're not a genius. You're just using leverage, and you're going to blow up eventually.